Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Intelligence Spotlight series. As always, we are hosting incredible people in our podcast and in this show. Today, we're honored to introduce Neus Vidal Martí, who is the executive director for Seek Initiative. She's also a journalist and a political scientist who specializes in access to information and media policies. She has worked as an investigative reporter and as a program manager in several countries. Before joining the Seek Initiative, she was in charge of monitoring violations of media freedom at the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, where she also worked on advocacy regarding media relations and freedom of information. Noyce is an experienced conference host as well, and also a panelist, and she's usually invited to speak on access to information, media freedom, rule of law, and journalism. She has taught journalism at several universities and is currently on the advisory board of the Rule of Law program at the Constitution. Noyes holds a double degree in journalism and political science and is an investigative journalism master's degree and is currently pursuing a political PhD at Birkbeck College, University of London. Thank you for accepting the invitation, Noyes, and welcome.
Thanks for having me, Kai.
I'm very, very interested in knowing the stories of people and who they are, where they come from. And of course, you've had this incredible journey in journalism and political science, and now you're leading the Seek Initiative. It's such a fascinating shift, actually. So, could you talk a bit about what pushed you to make this change? And was there a particular moment or story that sparked your decision?
Yeah, right. So, as you mentioned, I have spent most of my career working as a journalist or researcher. But I think what has actually always driven my career, whatever I was doing, is working on public interest matters. So, for me, information is not something that belongs only to journalists. So I spent a lot of my time also trying to teach people to access information using Freedom of Information Act. Before joining SIG, this is pretty much what I was doing, right? In media policy and the media freedom activism, and also helping people use this Freedom of Information Act. So you said a shift. I don't really see that much of a shift or a transition, because whatever I'm doing, whether it's writing or speaking, or teaching, I'm always driven by that, just trying to make sure that people can access information, whatever I am doing, and information that is in the public interest. So directing SIG for me is essentially doing the same from a different position.
A shift to a better part of what you're doing. Regarding the Seek Initiative, it's doing something really unique, empowering citizen journalists, investigators, which, to my understanding, are people outside traditional institutions who take on investigative work. Could you explain a bit about what your mission is and how you're helping these investigators and grassroots activists to make real impact?
For sure. So the SIG Initiative is a Berlin-based organization that's fairly young. It's been going on for 2.5 years. Essentially what it does is it supports community leaders, also journalists and civil society organizations, so they can drive change in their communities through what we call grassroots investigations and helping them investigate always in the public interest. I'm going to be insisting a lot on that because I think that's a very important distinction that we need to make here. So you mentioned who can be an investigator, right? So we think that really anybody with the right tools and the right training can be an investigator. And it doesn't mean that everyone is going to investigate everything, and it's going to be different because people are interested in different things. So somebody might be interested in, I don't know, finding out how much that hospital in their town costs, or pollution in a river that's nearby their house. So in a way, we envision this society where everybody has an interest in investigating something. And it doesn't matter your origin, your background, your training. If you're given the right tools, you can actually investigate and find out something that is in the public interest for your community. And as I said before, it's not going to be the same for everyone. That's why we've developed this sort of specific training. So it might be at some point you need to learn how to send information documents, how to talk to sources and interview them, or learn how to find out a story in a database. And that's why we adapt also our curriculum to those specifically.
Incredible to hear that. Makes it, of course, unique in that way. And talking of grassroots investigations, it's also a powerful way to uncover local issues. But I can also imagine that there's also the challenge of maintaining credibility and the ethics part. So, what's your thinking behind supporting these investigations? And do you make sure they're both effective and trustworthy?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we look at this is we want to enable people to engage their communities in this sort of process of finding out what is actually happening in your community. The way we do it is by teaching them how to investigate and working with them. Because if we think about it, citizens have some sort of privileged access to stories that many journalists don't have. So they know their communities very well. They're trusted in their communities. They also speak the language sometimes that journalists don't speak or they don't have that sort of source in there. So we definitely need to work with citizens. Does that mean that citizens on their own need to investigate everything alone? No, not at all. I mean, they can collaborate with newsrooms. They can collaborate with civil society organizations. So the way we approach this is we actually want to build this network of citizens, of civil society organizations, of community newsrooms that want to work very close to citizens, to communities, and they want to work in the public interest so they can hold local authorities, national authorities accountable. And we can build this sort of like way of working together. I think there's more and more newsrooms and we're seeing that there are sort of that community approach, which is really good. But I think this active role of citizens of doing something that they can actually do and investigate, it's kind of lacking. So that's what we're trying to empower that too. And put them in touch also with the newsrooms.
I'm sure people who are listening at this part of the Intelligence Spotlight series, how can they get involved and seek initiative? I'm sure there may be ways to do that, and whether it's individuals or organizations that could involve, or are there ways they could support the initiative or be just part of this work?
So we not only encourage collaboration, we actively seek collaboration, and in fact, we have collaborated. We're collaborating with different organizations. So if anybody wants to get in touch, we're always open to different investigative ideas and projects and so on. So you can get in touch with us through our website or social media, even me directly on LinkedIn. Just very happy to hear from people with ideas and projects they want to work on, and then we can arrange something. In 2025, we're starting to sort of shift a little bit our strategy and just going to work mostly in Europe. I guess for people listening, if you're working in Europe in citizen engagement, in grassroots investigation, please get in touch because we definitely want to hear from you. And we have also ideas to collaborate. So anyone who's just really, really open.
Thank you. So another aspect I was very interested was in terms of finding stories and public data. Sometimes sounds exciting, but also it's a bit tricky. Could you maybe share some practical tips or tools that citizens and journalists can use access to information held by public authorities? Maybe some examples of how it's been done successfully in the past. And usually, when it comes to citizen journalism or grassroots initiatives, they may find it hard to find some information that are related to governance. So, in that regard, maybe it could be a way for you to, based on your background, to explain a bit about that.
So I think with that, the most important thing is something that's a very powerful or can be potentially a very powerful tool, which are access to information laws, sometimes called Freedom of Information Act, depends on the country, transparency laws, but essentially access to information legislation. In fact, more than 100 countries around the world have passed some sort of access to information law. So what are these pieces of legislation? What they do is they allow citizens to request information held by public authorities. And this is very important because it is not about journalists accessing information through a press channel or like a press officer and so on. This is a citizen's right to know what their governments are doing. So anybody, essentially that means that they can request information, and this can be like very simple things like asking, you've got a local hospital and you want to know the waiting list and that's not published. Well, then you can ask for that. or like something that's in care homes from COVID. You can request those things that people care about. It might not be to do like the big investigation in the newspaper, but that actually is very close to what people want to know from their authorities. And you've got this tool. The problem is, and sometimes they don't work, and we can talk about that, and there's exemptions and so on. But the main problem that I see is that most citizens don't even know these laws exist. And if they do know, they barely use them. So I think we really need to train citizens to use them better and to make use of that, because they can be very, very powerful for everyone to know what their local authorities are doing.
Precisely. And I'm sure that law varies across different countries on the level of access that the citizens can have. Do you think, because with the internet, we see that internet, electricity, things that were initially not part of the Universal Human Rights Declaration, but it's a human necessity to access them or to have access to them. Do you think this particular law could also be incorporated in the developed or developing countries to be part of a human rights law and in specific areas of, as you mentioned, healthcare, education, and other fields?
This law is sort of based on our freedom of expression and so on. So this is not something that comes out of nowhere in a way, right? So this is the citizen space. And essentially, if you want to have freedom of expression, you want to be able to have a say in the public sphere, you need to have the right information. So this is like how it's structured in many countries. And as I said, many countries have a law that's very good on paper. And that's great. But one of the main issues here is also, how do these laws actually work in practice? Because it's really worthless to have a really nice law on paper, but then authorities don't follow it if the implementation process is really not followed. So we have, and we see different problems depending on the countries. You said each country has its own law. Even in Europe, which I find that to be really problematic, each European country has its own FOI, which means that something that can be accessible in France is not accessible in Spain or Germany, and these are countries that share the border, and people live 20 kilometers from each other and they have different access rights. That's very problematic. But what we see pretty much across is that authorities sometimes just miss the deadlines to answer these requests. So it's sort of really, really bad for people that get information in that same moment, like journalists and so on, but also for citizens. Because if they're going to take 6 months to get a response, and they're just going to forget about that. Sometimes even worse, authorities forget, or I would say, I think that's a generous way of saying it. They just don't want to reply, and I don't. So there's requests that go unanswered. That's also problematic. And what I think we're seeing more and more, also the misuse of exemption. For example, data protection or national security. But let's talk about data protection, because it's used pretty much in every single request that one sends nowadays. There's an exemption that they just say, oh, it's data protection, when it isn't. If it is, we can discuss it. But in many cases, that's not the case. So citizens who just send a request and they're given that, no, this is protected by data protection, they're just not going to pursue it further. I think these are things that we really need to look at. More than just like, okay, it's good to have a piece of legislation. Yes, for sure. But let's look at the implementation of this and the enforcement, of course. So basically, for us, it's really important that citizens know this is what you can do, use it, because then authorities are going to see that citizens know about it.
I can imagine that it's not always that easy, especially authorities don't make it easy at all. Apart from that, what are some of the biggest issues usually people run into? There are different varying levels of access to information. Some European countries have curbed the freedom of expression. Some have allowed them. Even in Germany, for instance, there are concerns that journalists are being attacked or that they are prevented from accessing certain information. You can maybe talk about which countries are actually advancing in that regard and which countries are being prevented from advancing in the areas of access to information.
Right. So I think the most important thing that we face in Europe and specifically in the EU, and I have actually written about this and talked to a lot of people about that, I believe we need harmonization of freedom of information acts in Europe, because each country has its own law. Sometimes the same country, also in different states, regions, they also have different laws. So that sort of disparity of access. In the EU, where we have many connections, commercial, economic, social, political, it just doesn't make sense that citizens that live in this union don't have the same right to access information about what their governments are doing. So to me, it would be a priority, and I know to other people too, to start thinking about what sort of basic points that this sort of common framework should have. So at least
Hmm.
every EU country would have the same or very similar access to information legislation and framework.
Right. When it comes to reporting on sensitive topics, I'm sure every country in Europe has certain topics that they report on and are considered very sensitive. Let's say, for example, we have migration. It's very sensitive in Germany recently, or in other countries. It might be another topic in another country. So there must be also moments where transparency and ethics seem to clash. How do you handle that balance? Are there examples that you can give where you've had to make tough calls in this area or have seen other people doing that?
It's very hard to have like an answer that works for every case, right? Because this is done on a sort of case by case basis here for me. So it's always going to be a balance between one right, whatever it is, whether it's privacy and the right to information.
Mhm.
And we need to be very careful here and just to make sure that we're striking the right balance. For me, it all comes down to this public interest assessment or a public interest status as it's called in the law, but essentially so people really can understand what that is. So take the example of data protection about personal data. So we might have some personal data about somebody, and that is off limits for publication, usually, if it comes to like a very sensitive personal data about an individual. So I wouldn't publish personal data about a personal individual that has no relevance in the public sphere. But that same information, if that is from a public authority or somebody who's, let's say, a prime minister, that might have some relevance or
Mhm.
um, their ability also to carry out their work in a neutral way and so on. So I will think about that. If it's the same person, like an anonymous person, I'm not publishing it. But if it's a public authority, then I'm going to have to publish that because that is in the public interest, because it might affect their ability as in their public role. So we need to strike that balance, and the courts also do that, where like the right of people to know it's actually something that they protect more than the right to privacy to that public authority. So as I said, it's a
Right.
case by case thing that needs to be analyzed every time you face one of these conflicts.
Right. And I do agree with that part because there have been different instances in areas of open source investigations where people who are interested or aspiring journalists, they ask that, okay, how should I approach that? And it all comes down to your own personal judgment of different cases and different scenarios. I also had a meeting with a student who wants to do investigations and wanted to know about whether she could put her name and her investigative reporting or not. I said, whatever topic you're investigating on, you should judge and do your own risk assessment, for instance, or ethical assessments on different cases. Absolutely. And it also seems like there is this huge potential when journalists and citizen investigators team up. So, what do you think is the best way for them to work together? And for anyone just starting out in this field, do you have any particular advice for them or tools you want to suggest?
If we're talking about an investigation or something that needs public interest, like holding governments to account or something like that, you can just do it on your own. This sort of civic work always needs everyone who can do this. So it's not just going to be journalists. It's not just going to be citizens or civil society organizations. It's just working together to do what? I think this is the main thing. Like in whatever position you are, just think about, is this in the public interest? To me, that's always what it comes down to. So if you're a young journalist or if you're a young researcher doing like all things, you're not a journalist, just think, is what I'm doing actually helping other people in my community? If I publish something, will they be better off? Will they know a bit more to participate in the public sphere? Then just go ahead. And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be like really big story. There's a real lack of information about what's happening in really small villages and local authorities and so on. So start small. Ask your local government, okay, like what happened with the bike lanes here? Because you said there would be bike lanes here and no bike lanes anymore. What happened with the parking spaces at the university? We just don't have them anymore. What's happening? And only that piece of information can be really, really useful. So start small and think, am I benefiting other people by doing this work? And if the answer is yes, just go ahead and do it.
Thank you, Noise, for your time and for your insightful information about access to information, about the Seek initiative, and also such a great advice about teaming up for young investigators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.